So, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, or good day, or good morning, whenever you watch this. This is again the Boring Lectures channel from Kleve, Germany, with some lectures online. This time again for the study program International Taxation and Law. And today is due some remarks on general introduction of tax law. So, the very beginning of everything which you hear about taxation during our study program. Just to introduce myself again, for those who do not yet know me, my name is Norbert Dotzenberg, living at Kleve, being a professor at the Rheinval University of Kleve, and we have students from all over the world coming to Kleve and having a look into taxation and law with the focus on taxation. And since we have some new developments due to the coronavirus, naturally, that was a big temptation to place some part of the lecture stuff online, and this is why you have me here now. Okay, let's first begin with some basics. Naturally, everybody does this. The first thing is probably you want to know what you are dealing about with during the next weeks and months and years. So what is a tax, for example, is the first important thing. And before we go into details, naturally, you will probably ask yourself, oh, the guy is directly beginning totally boring. Instead of telling us something about taxation, he first thinks about the term tax. Well, that is a good, let's say, a good moment to make a remark on something which you probably need for the rest of your life, and that is the reason why the header has been marked in green. There are some things which are of general interest for your studies or for academic work. So whenever we turn to green in the header, then we will probably give you some basic information which you need not only for this lecture but for all the time which comes. So the question is now, why define such a term like taxation first? And the answer is, before you talk about something properly, you should clarify what you mean by the terms, so that people, especially from different nations and different parts of the world, can agree on what they are talking about. You must always keep in mind, when it comes to international things or international contacts, then the person who speaks with you probably does not have the same cultural background than you have. So there might be different conceptions of what a tax might be. And so in the end, you might end up with heavy disputes just because you didn't find out that for the other person, the terms which you regard as clear mean something different. So everybody thought they were right, and you didn't find out that the reason for all your disputes and misunderstandings was simply that you had different understandings of the things what you were going or willing to talk about. So clarifying what you mean by the words is very often very helpful, and very often once you have a definition, you can draw many important conclusions on that, and especially you can find out if you all agree to the same basics or if there are different views on the world. So that is important to look to start with first. Good. Now very often you have different terms for the same thing, or it might even be the other way around. You use the same word for different things, so for a different meaning. That is what you must find out in the beginning, and especially with English technical terms, you cannot rely that they have always the same meaning, because English is the official language in many countries of the world, and so there is not one single parliament or legislating body which might decide on a binding meaning for all countries of the world. It might be that the official language of one country understands or uses a term in one way, and another country uses a different word for the same thing, or understands the technical term in a different way. And so you must expect a chaos. And so it's important to speak about the meaning of the words which you use first. Well, um, even in a country like Germany, where I live, you have the problem with German technical terms in a reduced manner, because there is not only Germany, where German is official language, but also Austria, or even the small Principality of Liechtenstein in the surroundings of Switzerland. So they might have different official terms, although in the German language area, usually the meanings which are current in Germany itself do prevail. Good. Now, when you agree on what you want to say with a technical term, with the word, naturally there can be no true and false, because what a word means is just an agreement between the people speaking to each other. So no true or false, but it can be, yeah, useful or not. So naturally, if you want to define something, it makes sense to try to find out what the general understanding of the term is, or if you think it should be necessary to deviate from the general understanding of the people running around out there and reading the Mirror, the Bild-Zeitung, or other low standard newspapers, then perhaps you should at least have good reasons why you define something more precisely or differently, like the general understanding is. So when we want to look at a term like tax, it might be a good idea to see or to look first to the general world outside. How do people usually use that word tax, and what can we find out? So then we can make up, let's say, a kind of a checklist what such a term could mean. Good. So if we talk about a tax, then let's look where we would use the word for and where we would say this is not a tax. So imagine, first example, you give away 100,000 euro of your money to a state institution for free, for example, to a hospital, to a university, or even to your city. This is clearly not a tax. We all agree on that because it was a voluntary payment. So a first thing which we evidently silently always understand when we talk about a tax is a tax must be something which is not voluntarily paid, but something which is compulsory, which you can't avoid, which is taken away from you without that you want it. Taxes are not nice. Now something which is taken by the state in a compulsory way would also be conscription service in the army. You are forced to serve, let's say, a year or 3 or 2 in the army of your country. So you have to give services, well, your labor for 1, 2, or 3 years to the state for free. This is not a tax, but a conscription service. So why is this not a tax, although it is compulsory service? Evidently, the difference is that a tax is usually paid in money, and labor is, so even if it's forced, something different. So evidently we can say we might, or we usually connect with the term tax that it is about money. Good. It might even be that you are a burglar and then are caught by the police. Then you might be sent to prison. You all know that's a punishment. Now, sometimes the punishment, the imprisonment, is replaced by the duty to pay money to the state in order to replace imprisonment. just by a monetary punishment payment, which would be called a fine. Perhaps, by the way, a fine is not always fine if you have to pay it. It's ugly. So compulsory payment made to the state, evidently, not to a private person. That is in line with the term tax, but nobody would call this a tax. Evidently, the primary aim to punish people instead of collecting money, that seems to exclude that we can call this a tax. So the primary or one of the primary aims should be to obtain revenue, money for the state. And this is not the case if a fine is demanded from you for a wrong behavior. Now we also have cases where, for example, you apply for a new passport, go to the competent authority where you get that passport, and then the officer serving there gives you your new passport and says, okay, that costs you 50 euro. Then you are usually surprised, but you have to pay. You can't avoid that payment, but it's usually not a tax. Why? The answer is simple. You get something in return. So it's not a payment for nothing, it's a payment for the new passport. And that is the distinction. So in general, one would call this a fee. A fee is something where you have to make a payment to a state institution, but where you get something concrete in return. Here my 50 euro, here your passport. On the other hand, there are also some cases where you belong to a group of people and have to pay, let's say, a certain percentage of your income or so. You can't avoid that. So it's a compulsory payment to the state, to a state institution, and you don't get something concrete in return, so you don't pay for a concrete service or for a concrete thing which you get, but at least you have the right to use the services of that institution or of that system. The classical example for this is, for example, in Germany, the average citizen has to become a member of the state-run social security system, where you have to pay for the state-run health insurance, a certain percentage of your income. So money is taken away from you by a state institution, but you get a right in return, because you get a right to use the doctors and the hospitals belonging to the system when you need them. So it's not the same as a fee, because when you pay health insurance, you are not forced to get sick and to go to the doctor. You can, but you need not. That makes the difference. You can make use of it if you want and if you need. If you don't want or if you don't need, nobody forces you, but you paid for having the right to use the system. The same, by the way, with the public broadcasting system in Germany. Nearly everybody who has an own household has to pay a contribution, which is fixed, to that system. In return, you have the right to listen to the state broadcasting or television system. Sometimes, due to the quality of that is not recommendable. So not everybody does this. Sometimes you use instead the private television system. But what remains is you pay for the state system and you have a right to use it. So this is not a tax and not a fee, but a contribution. So what remains for a tax is the case where you make a compulsory payment to the state and get nothing in return. So to give you a first classification of these distinctions, we have here the overall term levies. Singular is one levy, a compulsory payment to the state in order to finance a state institution or the state itself. The first alternative is a fee, that thing where you get something concrete in return for which you have to pay, let's say, your passport or You pay for the weekly waste disposal by the city where you live. Number two, a contribution like your contribution to the public health insurance system. You gain the right to use its services when you need it. And number three, what remains is payments for which you have no claim whatsoever to any counter performance in return. So that seems to be the mark of a tax. And ladies and gentlemen, that naturally explains why taxes are the most hated thing. Because you really have nothing which you get in return. For example, you don't even pay for, because you are somebody who lives here or has a right to the services, the general services or things done by the state, because there is no inner connection between paying and having the right to use these things which the state finances by taxation. The public streets are paid from tax revenue, but you can also walk over these streets just if you never paid taxes. Remember the beautiful times of your childhood. You played in the streets and you never paid taxes. Nobody hindered you. No policeman arrested you and said, don't use this street, you didn't pay for it. So that makes clear that things funded by taxation are different from a contribution. Whereas, still, if you didn't make payments to the state health insurance system, you do not have a right to use it for free. So if you are so unhappy that you never paid to the national health insurance system and you have to go to hospital, then the hospital later sends you an invoice for its services and will try to collect the money because you were not insured, so they can bill you with the costs which you caused them, whereas all the others who contributed will get away for free because they already paid for the right to use that system. So sometimes, by the way, if nearly everybody belongs to a group which pays a contribution, to draw the line between a tax and a contribution becomes more and more difficult. For example, when practically everybody in the population has to pay the health insurance contribution, then the question sometimes remains, where is then still the difference between a tax-funded system and a contribution-funded system? And the answer is, well, if those people who do not pay, who are not obliged to pay, have no right to use that system or the services of that system for free, then that might be still a possibility to make a distinction. But in many, many states where, for example, nearly 99% of the population are covered by a mandatory health insurance system, then naturally the people do not see the line or the distinction between tax and contribution so clearly. So the people who don't bother too much about defining terms in the beginning sometimes just talk about the health insurance contribution as a tax. For example, English literature often does this. The English very often do not bother too much about defining terms first. That's rather the philosophical approach for them, so they don't care about it. And so I saw many textbooks on taxation where the health insurance contribution in the Anglo-Saxon area was classified as a kind of additional tax. They were so nice to call it just a kind of tax and not a proper tax, but for them the similarity was bigger than the distinctions, the differences. So there some differences come in mind already in the understanding of different nations. And by the way, you see perhaps in American discussions Anglo-Saxon tax idea, where they see a state-run health insurance system or the payments for that as a tax. The opposition of the people against such a system is far stronger than in an area where they have the German understanding. We suppose the Germans think, okay, health insurance is expensive, but you pay for something which you get in return. That's heavily expensive, up to 10 or 20% of your income, but they see there is a counter performance, and so the emotional attitude towards that is far is greatly different from the reaction to a mere tax. Okay, so here I sum that up again, and keep in mind the lines are sometimes a bit blurred, so not always clear. Well, that, by the way, gives you again a possibility to draw a first general conclusion. What happens in general when you think about the international area? Very often, different states or different cultures have a common basic understanding of what terms mean, but it might be that the smaller details show some differences in understanding. So it might be a danger that two people from different countries or cultures talk with each other. They find out they approximately speak about the same thing, and then they assume, well, also in the details, we probably speak about the same thing. So it is very often a good thing to think about the small distinctions or to see that the details might vary in the understanding. Okay. Yeah. So looking about or thinking of these definitions, like what is a tax, what is a contribution, what's a fee, there is often the question, isn't that simple rubbish, academic stuff? Can that have a practical consequence? And the answer is that also depends. For example, in Germany, we even have a definition of what the term tax means in one of our general tax laws, and I'm going to show you this soon in a second. Now here it is, that is the German official definition of the term tax in the German General Tax Code, the Abgabenordnung, which contains all rules which apply to more than one tax. So it's a kind of a framework for tax legislation. And here in section 3, or as Germans would say in paragraph 3, section 1 of that AO, they say taxes are monetary obligations which do not represent a consideration, so a payment for a specific service, and which are levied by a public body with the purpose to generate revenue from all those who fulfill the conditions under which the law creates the obligation. And the purpose to create a revenue must not necessarily be the main or only purpose, but that implies it must be one of the purposes. So by that, the fines are excluded. Here we have nearly all the conditions which we already found out. Additionally, we have mentioned that taxes must evidently be laid down in a law and that they have to be collected by everybody who is covered by that law. So a certain equality of taxation is also implied in the German understanding of a tax. We will have to talk about that later. Yeah. So this is the German definition. And what is not fulfilling the conditions here, monetary obligation and so on, would not be regarded as a tax in Germany, so tax rules would not apply. Well, there is even a general consent among experts that this German definition in the AO is also underlying the German Constitution. And that makes things interesting because Germany has a written constitution, and so people have certain rights which parliament can only restrict by laws if the constitution allows this. And now the trick is that the constitution gives parliament the right to levy taxes, but nothing else. For example, some decades ago, under the chancellorship of Helmut Schmidt, the government came to the idea we don't take a tax. We force rich people to give us a loan for a low interest rate. That's better than a tax, so they can't complain about taxation. They get the money back, but they have to lend it to us for a low interest rate, so compulsory credit was that. And somebody then complained to the Constitutional Court and said, well, such a forced credit to the state, it's not a tax because it doesn't have the purpose to generate revenue to finance the state expenditure, because revenue would only be money which the state can keep and can use for covering expense. But a credit amount must have to be paid back, so it cannot be considered as revenue. And if this is not something to generate revenue, it is not a tax. And if it is not a tax, then the Constitution does not allow this. And so this forced credit is an illegal state measure, and it's nil and void, and I'm not obliged to give the government a loan for the condition which they want to force me to give it for. And indeed, Constitutional Court said, yes, you're right. Constitution only allows taxes. Government says, well, but a mandatory credit is less harmful to the people than a tax. But then the Constitutional Court says, well, the Constitution has only allowed taxes, and there is even a good motive behind that, because taxes, well, the money is taken away from the population. That is something which the people probably don't like. And so if the public money which has been collected by taxes is then spent in a way which people don't agree with, they will punish the government in the next election by voting for the opposition. This supervision of the state authorities by the voters would probably be harmed if we allow measures of the state which are not foreseen by the Constitution. So they just saw Constitution allows a tax. This measure of the state was not a tax, so it was not allowed. So it is abolished by the courts, and the thing is gone. So that's one of the reasons. And that shows that thinking about a definition in a legal text, here the Constitution can have grave consequences. On the other hand, why don't you find such a thing in England? Well, the United Kingdom does not have a written constitution. Their tradition says Parliament has every right to legislate, apart from certain laws which are of such basic character that by tradition they cannot be overruled by new laws. The predominant opinion is there that Parliament can make every new law. So defining what Parliament can do, what a tax is, would make no sense there, because under the English system of legislation, inventing a new kind of levy, which is not foreseen in the English Constitution, would not be forbidden. Parliament can do everything there, So that is naturally an idea why the English people don't bother to invest too much mental strength or mental work into defining a text, because they say in the end, if we talk about the term, it makes no difference. In the end, Parliament can do everything what they want in our system, and so it makes no sense defining all the individual conditions. Whereas in a system with a written constitution, where you even have a constitutional court which then says certain measures of parliament are illegal and so must be abolished again, um, in such a system, naturally, talking about the exact details of what such a constitution means by the words tax or so makes enormous sense, and there naturally you will then find that. That's already also a difference which we can understand just from the cultural. By the way, the translation which you have seen just now was a personal translation made by me. Naturally, the original text of that paragraph 3.1a.o is in German language. Naturally, every country writes their laws in their own language. But from time to time, there are also official publications, official translations published in Germany into English by the Ministry of Fiscal Affairs, the Bundesfinanzministerium. So we happen to have an official translation of the Abgabenordnung, the AO, in that internet site here, www.gesetze-im-Internet.de, English AO index HTML. And then the important thing naturally is the translation which you find there has a completely different wording. And I show you that in order to make you familiar with one basic thing. When you inform yourself naturally in a translation about a legal matter, naturally you can't there stick too much to the words of a translation. You can see only what the translation conveys as meaning, as conditions, but there may always be small differences. So when it comes to reading a text, a German text on tax law, for example, in a translation, naturally, if you really want to find out if you can focus on the exact meaning of one word or so, or develop a theory, okay, if that one word doesn't perfectly fit, then everything there does not apply. Before you draw such conclusions, naturally, you should ask somebody who knows the original text if the translation really covers every aspect of the original text, because it's always very difficult to translate exactly. Naturally, this is also. But what will you be able to see again if you compare the definitions or the translations of the one and only definition here in 3.1? That is again that the basic characteristics evidently are covered or mentioned in both translations here. The monetary obligation, nothing in return, public body and not a private person levies the tax. That all have to pay who fulfill the legal requirements, and that you must end up with revenue for state institutions. That's the common thing. So evidently there all the translations agree in the basic points, and if you draw conclusions from the exact wording of a translation, naturally keep in mind, ask somebody who knows the original text if your conclusions which you want to draw from the translation are still covered from the original wording in the original language. Good. Now, as you probably come from totally different countries, there might be a good, interesting research task for you. Have a look to the definition of the term tax in your own country and just try to compare that with what we here just have agreed on. Have a look if there are differences or not, and wherever you come across the possibility to read something about taxation in another country, may it be France or USA or UK or oh, South Africa or what else, have a look on how they define tax and if they really bother to define it, or if that perhaps is a legal system where such details of the words would make no big consequences. So you can inform yourself already a bit about basics and see some differences in legal systems. Here in Germany, you could, for example, kill off a government credit of, let's say, 10 billion euro or so, if you can prove to the government this is not a legal measure if you want to force us to give you a credit, because here there is no legal basis which allows you to do this. Okay, very often you will find classifications of our taxes and levies, where you also get some additional information on what it means or how these things are calculated or fixed. For example, when you look here to that graphics or to this chart, you see a fee is something which is based on individual cost recovery, contribution, group cost recovery, and economic capability. So the ability to pay seems to be the basic principle for fixing the amount of taxes everybody has to pay. Now, that is important to know. The thing with the fee for the passport is that the fee shall be calculated in a way that it only covers the cost of that service which you have to take from the state. So the fee for the passport is only allowed to cover, at least from the German understanding, is only to cover the costs which the state has to incur for exactly this passport. So everything which is caused by printing that passport, a share in the cost of the printing machines, a part for the time, a part of the money which the officer is paid for the working time which is spent for your passport, and so on. But covering the costs, yes, but no profit. So the idea of a fee is combined with the idea a fee covers just the cost of the service or the thing which you get from the state. Now that's a bit surprising, because normally, well, you all have business administration or things like that in mind. So you would probably say, well, if the state prints passports, why no gain, no profit? And the answer is, think about it. A fee is a compulsory payment by definition. So you don't pay for a passport because you like to have a passport. State forces you to have a passport or an ID card. You can't choose. And so you are forced to buy a new passport. And now imagine what would happen if the state can make a profit by issuing passports to you. Well, I don't know what you would do if I were the Ministry of Fiscal Affairs. My attitude would be clear. I would always force you to buy a new passport every year, because if I don't only cover the costs for the passport, 50 euro, but I can add 10 euro as a profit margin on top, then I would earn 10 euro in every passport which I force you to buy. And that would be highly attractive. Naturally, I would say, well, passport, a new one only every 5 years. Isn't that a bit harsh? What about forcing the people to get a new passport every 2 years? Huh? then, in a way that nobody realized this, I make a strong profit, rather promising. And naturally, I would say, also those people who were not yet forced to become a member of the state national insurance system must become a member because I make profit by that. So I would force the people to obtain services which make no sense, perhaps, or with a frequency which makes no sense, just to make that profit. And that's unreasonable. And that it would be a waste of resources just to force people to get passports more often than they needed. And that is why a wise legislation or a wise constitution says, well, a fee just covers cost, but no profit. If a minister of fiscal affairs wants money for free, then they should not obtain it as profit, but as a tax, open and honestly. Otherwise, you will have tendencies that people are forced to use state services which they don't need. So with the passport, that should be the individual cost. And if you have to pay a contribution, then a contribution is meant to finance all the services which the members, the people of that group, which have to pay that contribution, and all these persons pay and enable that institution to work, but that the institution is not allowed to make profit. Because here you have again the same thing. If the institution can make a profit, then it's highly attractive to force people to become members of institutions which in reality nobody needs. For example, if you are a merchant, you are obliged to become a member in the Chamber of Commerce. And so all the merchants at a place have to share the financial burden, the costs of the Chamber of Commerce, employees, buildings, and so on. And that's harsh enough for them. But now imagine the state could make a profit by that. And more people would be forced to become members of such a chamber. You would probably establish a chamber of students where every student has to become a member, just not because that would make sense, but because the state would see a way to make a profit there. And now if you say with a contribution for the possibility to use some rights, the state or whoever sets up that contribution system can never make a profit. By that, you have automatically an inbuilt precaution which keeps the state away from forcing the people to use unnecessary services. Institutions which are not needed will not be set up because it brings nothing for the state to set up an institution which is financed by contribution. It's always a plus minus zero affair, no profit possible. That is why the overall principle for defining contributions is a contribution shall be fixed or calculated in a way that the costs of the institution are covered by the group which can use the institution, but that the profit is definitively excluded. Good. And now by taxes, well, there you can't look to what the people get for it, so of the costs of state services, because state is not obliged to render any services. So the only thing which taxes should do is cover all these expenses of the state which cannot be financed by fees and contributions. And now the question is how you distribute the tax burden to the individual persons. And there we have the theory that it would be just if the people are taxed differently according to their economic capability, so that rich people should pay a bit more than the very poor ones, and not everybody pays the same amount because that would be regarded as unfair. And so one tries to explain that by theories or by terms. Equivalence theory is that a fee should be equivalent to the costs of the service which is rendered, whereas distributing tax among the citizens, who has to pay which share in the public expenditure, that should come equal to a kind of equal sacrifice, that everybody gives an equal share, for example, or shares an equal burden, suffers an equal sacrifice. And that, for example, implies different amounts or even different percentages. The idea is, for example, if you have 100 million income, then it makes for you not a huge difference if you have to give away 39 of them or 34 of them or 42. The sacrifice the additional sacrifice of 2 million or 8 million is probably not really felt. It does not change your daily life strongly. Whereas on the other hand, if somebody only has 1,000 euro to live from during a month and you take away 20% of that, that will change the everyday life of that person brutally, will be heavily felt, and so the sacrifice which that person can feel in everyday life is probably different. And that is why it says when it comes to determining taxes for individual persons, one should not look to which services these people get from the state. That makes no sense. By definition, that's excluded. You should not treat everybody equally under the financial aspect. You should treat them equally under an aspect of justice. So how much damage or burden you inflict to the individual persons. And that is why we speak here of equal sacrifice theory. Okay, now I hope you could enjoy this lecture a bit, perhaps a very small bit, one never knows. And the only thing which remains is to ask you if you can please subscribe to this channel and recommend this channel to people whom you like or whom you do not like, whatever applies. Thank you very much for watching and hope to see you again soon. Ciao.